Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today is going to be very exciting. I've got this glorious 997.2 GT3. This belongs to my good friend Tom, who actually recently lent me his amazing Taycan. So if you haven't seen that video already, please check it out. There's a link up here somewhere. I was very impressed with that. The Taycan is a car almost from the future, whereas this is a 10-year-old GT car, and I would say one of the absolute greats, not just in the Porsche GT lineup, but in drivers' cars in general. I've been dying to drive one of these. Obviously, you know that I'm a massive fan of the 981 GT4, and I'm quite interested to compare the two. I wouldn't say back to back because I haven't driven a GT4 for a couple of years now, but the memories are still quite fresh because I absolutely love that car. This one has actually got one of the last Metzger engines in it. So we're talking a 3.8 litre flat six, produces about 430 horsepower, but it weighs just under 1400 kilos. So it should be pretty rapid, certainly rapid enough for a car of this size. Porsche only produced just over 2,000 of these globally, and I believe the UK received between 120 and 160 of them. So this is an extremely rare car. Before the rain gets any heavier, I'm going to jump inside the car, we'll have a quick look at the cabin and then take it out for a drive. Jumping inside this car, it feels extremely special. We've got to remember this is 10 years old, and in fact it's based on a 997 which effectively came out in 2004-ish. So we are going to expect some of the cabin to look a bit dated, but I don't care about that. What I care about is driving position and obviously how this car feels. Looking behind me, there's a big blank area. There are no seats, but there's no cage either. That's because this isn't a Club Sport GT3. This is the standard GT3. But you might be confused by the fact that it does have the optional carbon seats, which just look fantastic, and I can tell you feel really supportive and comfortable. And in fact, this car does have the optional carbon ceramic brakes as well, which again is something you would normally only find on the Club Sport spec. The fact this doesn't have a cage is actually pretty handy for Tom, the owner, because he takes this on petrolhead tours, and on those trips you never have enough luggage space, especially in sports or supercars. But that's really handy storage space to put a lot of luggage in, along with obviously the frunk at the front, which all 911s have. But otherwise, everything else in here is as you would expect. The next thing to do is the most important thing, really, take it out and enjoy myself. Oh yeah. Sport button changes the exhaust valves. Engine's warm, so I'll just give it a little rev for you. Wow. And that's only 5,000 RPM. This revs up to about 8,500. Excuse me if I don't talk too much during this driving bit of the video. I'm just going to enjoy this sound, as I'm sure you guys and girls are too. I mean, it's just epic. What a car. So we're listening to a 3.8 litre flat six Metzger engine, producing 430 odd brake horsepower at 7,900 RPM. It's really not very torquey. I think peak torque's at like 3,000 or something like that. So anything below about 2.5, it really doesn't have much. But that's kind of what you want and what you expect in an NA engine. It's just brilliant. What a car. I've actually been driving this for about 3 hours now, and I've done a good couple of 100 miles on it, which I'm so grateful. Thank you very much, Tom. I mean, these cars are worth a lot of money, and obviously they're quite mileage sensitive, so to be able to spend a whole day in one and burn at least a tank of fuel is just, I'm very fortunate, very, very fortunate. I really think this era of car, 2008, 9, 10, 11, maybe 12, it's a real sweet spot for organic and mechanical feeling cars, you know. Yes, this has got a lot of modern traction aids and things like that, but when you turn all that off, the car just feels so alive. It really does. I have to say, it feels so small on the road. It's not particularly big on the outside, especially by modern day 911 standards. This is far smaller than, say, a typical 992. But it really does feel nice and small and compact in here. If you've ever driven a 911, one thing you tend to do, depending on which model it is, when you look in the mirrors, you always have quite wide rear arches, a wide bum, so you've got to navigate you through, especially going through towns and stuff, you've got to be careful. But in the 997 generation, the GT3 actually had the narrow body, so it has the narrower hips on the back, which at the time people complained about, or they maybe talked about preferring the RS, which had the wider turbo body because it looked far more aggressive. But I think now, as cars are getting bigger, I really appreciate the fact that this car's got the narrow hips. It just makes the whole car and the dimensions look and appear a lot slimmer. Is it fast? Well, by modern standards, it's not lightning quick. I think it has a claimed 0 to 62 figure of 4.1 seconds. And to me, it feels about as quick as my M2 competition. But you have to focus a lot more in this, because although the suspension is really good and it has a fair amount of aero and stuff, it does move around quite a lot in a typical sort of period 911 way. The front end, typically 997, it is a little bit vague. Not as vague as a Gen 1 997 Carrera, where you feel like you need to stick some sandbags in the front to keep the front end down. Nothing like that, but the front end is still a little bit floaty and doesn't massively inspire you with confidence. But I think owning one of these and spending a lot more time than just a day in one would definitely get your head around that, and you'd understand its handling characteristics a lot better. In terms of traction, well, it's actually been very wet for much of today, and I must admit I've kept the traction control on because it's not my car, and it's valued at just over £100,000, this car, and I really would not want to put it off into a bush or into a field somewhere. So it feels very, very well planted from the back. Again, typically 911, loads of traction. I think the saying is slow in, fast out, and you can just put your foot down in any gear and it's just, there's no issues at all in terms of laying down the 430 odd brake horsepower. Brakes are very good. This one's actually got the carbon ceramic brake option, which was quite rare on a non-club sport car. And in fact, this particular car with the bucket seats and the carbon ceramic brakes is very rare, because normally you'd find those two options on a lot of the club sport spec cars with the cage in the back. But I really like this, and it means it's very practical. You've got loads of storage space in the back, and it just makes it a very usable and practical 911. Had a lot of thumbs up about this car today, understandably. I mean, obviously there's no rev matching, it's all your own inputs, which is great. I've kind of had to relearn how to do it in a Porsche with such a free revving motor as well. In my M2 I can obviously do heel and toe no problem, but it's a completely different pickup on the throttle. This one is just a tiny, oh, it's just lovely. got in this morning, the first 10 minutes were quite difficult actually. It's a very, very mechanical feeling car. The clutch is really, really heavy. The gear change itself is really, really heavy. Like, to put it into gear, it's almost like a gated gearbox in a way. It's beautifully rewarding, but it really is quite heavy. So the first 10 minutes of driving this car, maybe the first 20 minutes even, I was struggling to get to grips with it properly, especially doing things like the heel and toe and stuff. It was just very, very mechanical, and you don't have to force things to fit because everything is so engaging, but you have to use some muscle, which I'm just not used to with these modern cars, especially as most of them tend to be automatic these days. Okay, I'm going to do one launch. I'm not going to be really aggressive on the clutch or the launch because it's not my car and I don't want to destroy Tom's clutch, but let's just do a quick launch to 60 miles an hour, just for your own benefit listening really, because it's all about sound with this car. Right, here we go. Traction. And 60. Doesn't that just sound so good? This is a stock exhaust on here. Imagine what it would sound like with, well, I think it's Shark Works that make really, really incredible exhaust. Wow, it sounds so good. I've actually got the sport button pressed, and that effectively makes the car a bit louder, opens the flaps. Listen to that. Oh, it's just glorious, this car. I was really keen to find out about with this car is what it's like compared to the 981 GT4. Many of you know that's pretty much my favourite driver's car, and they're very different. What you must remember is this car is about 5 or 6 years older than the GT4, so I always had to keep that in the back of my mind, because the GT4 definitely feels a bit more modern when driving. This has got the 911 traits that I talked about, especially the 997 ones with the slightly, not vague, but light front end, whereas the Cayman definitely doesn't have that. But then this has better traction out of junctions or corners, as we've already talked about. Oh, it's just so addictive, that sound, it really is. This has a much better, not gearbox, but much better ratios in the gearbox. I think in the GT4 981 you're doing about 90 miles an hour top a second, whereas in this one it's closer to sort of 65, 70 miles an hour. So you tend to use second, third, fourth on roads like this, whereas in the Cayman you're second, sometimes third, which is frustrating and does take a lot of performance away from the Cayman. And I think that's kind of what I've realised today more than anything, is the fact that a lot of people always said it was Porsche were holding things back with the Cayman GT4, and they definitely were, because I really think that the Cayman's actually a sweeter handling car than this. It also maybe arguably sounds a bit better as well, because the engine, rather than being rear mounted and right over the back like in this car, typically 911, with the Cayman it's just over your shoulders, and you really hear all the mechanical bit of the engine. You hear everything going on in the engine. Even before startup you just hear, you know, all the injectors going, you hear everything, and it's just a real part of Cayman GT4 ownership, which you don't get in this particular car. But the overall feeling of this car and the smile it gives is on par with the GT4, and it is arguably a bit quicker, not just down to the gearing, the fact that it has an extra, what is it, 50 odd brake horsepower that you do feel, because it doesn't really weigh much more. This is just under 1400 kilos, which is very impressive, especially by today's standards. I would absolutely love love to take this car on a big road trip, like Tom has done in fact to the Petrolhead Tours or something, because I think it would just be the ultimate Petrolhead Tour car. Drive this to the Alps, spend 3 or 4 days in the Alps having the best fun, and then driving it back, because it's very comfortable. Even with these seats, driving position is pretty good, but I've sat in Porsches like the Cayman GT4 where it's better. And what I mean by that is, if this was a PDK or an automatic and I didn't need my clutch leg, I think it wouldn't be too bad at all. I'd really like it, but the steering doesn't quite come out close enough to me, so I have to sit closer seat wise, and because the back of the seat's not adjustable, but then I find that my legs are a bit cramped in the footwell. So again, someone of my height and size, the driving position's not perfect. I would even go as far as saying the driving position in my M2 competition is better for a manual setup for someone of my height. Someone a bit shorter, I'm sure they have no issues with this, but yeah, my knee my knee's kind of in its resting place, is up really close to the steering wheel. But yeah, what a car. I mean, opportunities like this don't come around very often, in fact hardly ever, and I'm very, very fortunate to get this opportunity and drive this car. So before we sign off, I just want to say once again, massive thanks to Tom for literally throwing me the keys and putting me up for a couple of days up here in beautiful Yorkshire. I mean, it's just amazing up here, it really is. The weather's not been great, but we've lucked it out on this little drive. So thanks so much, Tom. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you at the next video very soon. Cheers.